Hi, these are the most interesting historical photos that I could find. Let's go. Teenagers from areas affected by the 1986 Chernobyl accident wait for care in Cuba, thousands of miles from home. Their shaved heads and clinic lights show how young patients were moved across the ocean after the world's worst nuclear accident. On May 6, 1968, Neil Armstrong floated down by parachute after leaving a lunar landing training vehicle seconds before it hit the ground. The same pilot walked on the moon 14 months later, making this failed test one of Apollo 11's closest calls. Around 1905 in Burundi, people built tall wooden leopard traps from poles, branches, and a raised cage-like frame. These handmade traps show how rural communities tried to protect livestock before modern wildlife controls existed. In 1869, Saigon, a wealthy Vietnamese man, displayed extremely long fingernails as a clear sign of high status. Nails like these showed he did not do hard handwork, turning the hand itself into a public symbol of wealth. On June 1, 1941, the Farhud in Baghdad shattered one of the oldest Jewish communities in the world. Reports later gave a toll from about 180 to 1,000 people, and many Iraqi Jews left the country during the 1950s. In 1963, teenager Randy Gardner stayed awake for 264 hours, setting the only verified record of its kind. By day 11, he could not do simple math, saw street signs as people, and then slept for 14 hours after the test. On February 13, 1991, these handprints were left on the Amaria shelter walls in Baghdad after a Gulf War airstrike hit the building while civilians were inside. More than 400 people did not survive, and the marks became one of the most haunting records of the 1991 war. In a safety demonstration, a woman held a protective glass panel inches from her face while her husband tested it from close range. The filmed test showed the panel could stop a direct close-range impact without shattering. In 1915, the Italian monarch watched the front through a tripod telescope, seated in the field instead of a palace room. Italy had just entered World War I, opening a brutal mountain front that lasted until 1918. Tallinn's old streets were left in ruins after Soviet air raids in 1944, with whole blocks reduced to stone and dust. Hundreds of civilians lost their lives, and large parts of Estonia's capital were damaged in one night. Spindletop in Beaumont, Texas, sent oil more than 100 feet into the air in January 1901, revealing one of America's richest hidden fields. That single well produced about 100,000 barrels a day and helped launch the Texas oil boom. The Great Flood of 1913 pushed entire houses off their foundations in Ohio, leaving streets filled with broken buildings instead of water. More than 400 people died across the Midwest, and the disaster changed flood control in the United States. Kilauea's 1924 eruption sent a huge ash cloud over Hawaii, while visitors stood close enough to watch from the ground. The activity came from Halemaumau crater and lasted from May 10th to May 28, 1924. In 1930s, Germany, members of an SS fencing club trained in full white gear beneath a black banner. The masks covered every face, and the twin lightning emblem linked the sports lesson to one of the darkest groups of that era. At the Sydney Street siege in London in 1911, Britain's Home Secretary stood close to the police line during a real armed standoff. The event began after a failed jewelry shop robbery and became one of the most famous street crises in Edwardian London. Workers climbed onto the Statue of Liberty's crown in New York to remove its metal rays before renovation work for the 1939 World's Fair. Each ray is part of the statue's 7-point crown, one of its most recognizable details since 1886. Arthur Oxford and Georgina Wright took their wedding vows inside the damaged St. Bartholomew's Church in East Ham, London, in 1941. The ceremony happened among broken beams and rubble during the London Blitz. American soldiers rested in white chairs at Adolf Hitler's former mountain retreat in Berchtesgaden, Germany, in 1945. The quiet view came just weeks after the site became one of the most symbolic captures of the final year of the war. Freed women prisoners at Bergen-Belsen received bread from a camp cookhouse on April 24, 1945, just days after British forces entered the camp. British troops found about 60,000 prisoners there in April 1945. Miss America contestants lined up in Atlantic City in 1921, the year the contest began as a beach event to keep tourists in town after summer. Their wool bathing suits show how different public fashion rules were just over 100 years ago. Albert Einstein's Princeton office was photographed on April 18, 1955, only hours after he passed away, with books, papers, and equations still spread across the room. The crowded desk and blackboard froze the last workspace of the scientist who changed modern physics. In June 1945, two sisters from a large family polished a long line of shoes on their doorstep, turning one small chore into a full street task. The rows of worn shoes show how much daily work one household carried just after World War II. A German Bf-109 fighter had its engine replaced at Sveti Vrak airfield in Bulgaria in 1941 near the Kresna Pass. The open engine and tripod crane show how frontline aircraft were repaired in rough field conditions far from factory workshops. Italian blackshirts crowd together in Ethiopia during Mussolini's 1935 to 1936 campaign, raising helmets and gear for the camera. Italy entered Addis Ababa in May 1936, and the image became part of the propaganda record of that conquest. A Sony Discman from 2001 sits behind glass like a museum relic, even though it once felt like cutting-edge portable music. It played compact discs one album at a time, and one hard step could make the song skip. A British sailor prepares a 4-inch naval round on an anti-aircraft ship in England in 1940, sitting on the ship's grog tub. The tub once held the daily rum ration, placing a strange old Navy tradition right beside frontline ship work. Fresh Chrysler car bodies rolled out of a Detroit factory in the 1940s, loaded in rows on an open truck under a giant rooftop sign. Detroit was producing cars at a scale that made the city the center of America's auto age. A famous Hollywood performer sang for United States service members in Korea in February 1954, wearing a black stage dress in freezing winter conditions. She performed 10 shows in 4 days for more than 100,000 service members. French soldiers rested in a red poppy field during the 1944 Italian campaign, with tanks and trucks parked beside the flowers. The campaign helped push Allied forces north through Italy after the 1943 landings. A British Royal Duchess posed in 1890 wearing the formal uniform of Colonel-in-Chief of the 64th Infantry Regiment. Her medals, white sash, and spiked helmet turned a studio portrait into a rare display of royal status in regiment dress. Russian troops sat shoulder to shoulder in a narrow trench in 1917, with rifles lined against the wall as German forces neared their position. That same year, Russia's army began to collapse under revolution, shortages, and the pressure of World War I. A martial arts film star launches a flying sidekick in The Big Boss, the 1971 movie that made him a major name across Asia. The film was made in Hong Kong and became a box office hit that helped change action cinema forever. United States Marines stand with Vietnamese children on a village road, a quiet pause inside one of the most photographed conflicts of the 20th century. Black service members faced especially high frontline risk in the early years of the Vietnam War. In 1972, a British milkman posed in a prize-winning uniform made to give ordinary doorstep milk delivery a sharper public image. Daily milk rounds were still common then, before supermarket milk and changing shopping habits made them much rarer. After President Harding passed away in 1923, his vice president took the oath at 2:47 in the morning inside a quiet Vermont farmhouse. His own father administered the oath by lamplight, and the new president soon went back to bed. Ann Sheridan received an honorary policewoman badge at Lake Arrowhead after filming Angels with Dirty Faces in 1938. The Hollywood star was given the badge while taking a mountain break, turning a lakeside visit into a strange studio-era photo moment. In 1926, Ku Klux Klan members filled a Ferris wheel in Canyon City, Colorado, turning a family amusement park into a public show of power. The group was so active in Colorado that its members held major political influence in the state during the 1920s. Heathrow Airport looked like a giant concrete puzzle in the 1950s, with 6 runways crossing in a tight star pattern. Its famous passenger terminals had not yet been built before Heathrow grew into one of the world's busiest airports. The CTP-1 remote-controlled robot worked in Pripyat in 1986 after the Chernobyl accident, where machines were sent into places too unsafe for long human work. Robots like this helped clear highly contaminated debris. A Bell Labs researcher holds an early silicon solar cell revealed on April 25, 1954, as the first practical device to turn sunlight into usable electric power. It reached about 6% efficiency and opened the path to modern solar panels. United States and Soviet soldiers met at Torgau on the Elbe River on April 25, 1945, cutting Germany in two from east and west. The handshake became known as Elbe Day, one of the clearest signs that World War II in Europe was almost over. Ray Charles laughed in the Georgia State Legislature on April 24, 1979, as his version of Georgia on My Mind became the official state song. The song was first recorded in 1930, but his 1960 version turned it into one of the most famous musical tributes to an American state. Space Shuttle Discovery lifted off from Cape Canaveral on April 24, 1990, carrying the Hubble Space Telescope into orbit. The $1.5 billion telescope later changed astronomy by capturing some of the clearest deep space images ever made. In 1908, Jacob Murdoch drove his family from Los Angeles to New York City in a Packard, finishing the coast-to-coast trip in 32 days, 5 hours, and 25 minutes. They crossed rough roads and dirt tracks before the United States had a modern highway system. Giant character balloons floated through Times Square during the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade in 1930, only 6 years after the parade began. Crowds packed the streets to see balloons pulled by hand before modern parade controls. Austro-Hungarian soldiers turned Montenegro's parliament in Cetinje into living quarters after entering the country in 1916. The room that once held political debate became a temporary barracks during World War I. A United States general waited inside a landing craft before going ashore in North Africa in 1942. The landing was part of Operation Torch, the first major American ground operation in the European and North African theater of World War II. A German Heinkel. He 111 rests in a British field after coming down during the Battle of Britain on August 30, 1940. Its glass nose and exposed engine show how close the air war came to quiet countryside in 1940. Thousands of boys filled Allegheny County playgrounds in 1926 for a district-wide marble tournament, turning a simple pocket game into a major local contest. Winners advanced through supervised games all week before the championship rounds at the McKeesport YMCA. A French Renault FT-17 was shown in the United States in 1919, drawing a crowd around one of the most advanced small tanks of its time. Its rotating turret and rear-engine layout became the basic pattern for many modern tanks. Soviet helicopters flew over Chernobyl on April 27, 1986, dropping materials onto the damaged Reactor 4 after the disaster began. The crews worked above high radiation, and their flights became one of the most haunting images of 1986. An 87-year-old cormorant fisherman stands on a bamboo raft in Yangshuo, keeping alive a river method used for more than 1,300 years. Trained birds once caught fish for food, but today, this rare skill mostly survives for visitors in China and Japan. An army chaplain walks beside an injured German prisoner near Avluy Wood on November 13, 1916, during the Battle of the Ancre. The battle was part of the Somme campaign, one of the largest and hardest campaigns of World War I. A 1950s Havana police lieutenant colonel posed with a sidearm, a stark image tied to Batista-era state power in Cuba. His name became linked to harsh repression after the Humboldt 7 case, where 4 young revolutionaries died. At Lourdes, crutches and braces were left behind by visitors who believed they had been healed in the early 1900s. The wall became a strange record of faith, medicine, and thousands of personal stories no one could fully prove. In 1917, an FE-2D observer had to stand exposed above the aircraft body to aim a rear Lewis gun while the plane was moving. The setup shows how early air crews worked before enclosed cockpits, radios, and modern aircraft protection. In 1945, German civilians left Eastern Europe carrying boxes, bedding, and sacks after borders shifted at the end of World War II. More than 12 million ethnic Germans were displaced in one of Europe's largest post-war population movements. More than 100 members of the Mothers' Union attended a service inside the ruined Coventry Cathedral in 1947. The cathedral had been shattered in 1940, but its broken walls became a powerful symbol of recovery. United States troops climbed down cargo nets from transport ships before the Incheon landing in September 1950, one of the boldest moves of the Korean War. The operation put forces behind enemy lines and helped retake Seoul within weeks. The secret Treaty of London was signed in 1915, promising Italy new territory if it joined Britain, France, and Russia. Within weeks, Italy entered World War I, turning a private deal into a major shift in Europe's balance of power. Venice's St. Mark's Campanile fell at 9:53 in the morning on July 14, 1902, just after the square had been cleared. A safety commission had called it stable 2 days earlier, and the only recorded loss was the caretaker's cat. A British mathematician and philosopher read a 1955 London statement warning that new nuclear arms could threaten humanity's future. The appeal was signed by 9 leading thinkers and became one of the most famous scientific calls for peace in the Cold War. A famous British actor's 1995 Los Angeles police photo spread worldwide just after his romantic comedy fame exploded. The scandal barely slowed his career, and he later turned the image into a public joke about his own past. Sailors on the United States cruiser Miami gathered piles of spent 6-inch casings near Palau on September 7, 1944. The deck was so covered with brass that one photo shows the scale of a single naval action. A Japanese soldier hands something to a Filipino girl during the 1942 to 1945 occupation, while other civilians watch in tense silence. Small public gestures like this stood beside daily shortages and strict military rule. British sailors lowered a 25-pounder field gun from a landing craft into the Gulf of Aden in 1962. At the time, sea disposal of old military equipment was still accepted before the 1972 London Convention changed the rules. A passenger eats a full turkey dinner aboard a Pan American Stratocruiser in 1949 when long flights were sold as luxury travel instead of simple transport. The double-deck aircraft had a lower lounge and wide sleeper seats. A giant Harmon Creek coal machine crossed Route 22 near Burgettstown in 1946, stopping traffic like a moving steel wall. In 1969, the same land became Hillman State Park after 3,654 acres were donated to Pennsylvania. Royal Air Force rescue crews reached a Waco glider floating in the water and pulled everyone aboard to safety. The photo captures the rare moment after a failed landing when the crew and soldiers were still standing on the aircraft instead of sinking with it. Shalbimai. In 1977, East 141st Street and St. Anne's Avenue in the South Bronx sat beside empty lots, scarred buildings, and a red car being fixed at the curb. The area became one of New York City's clearest symbols of urban collapse during the 1970s. In 1932, a cheese seller in Tbilisi cut large blocks on a round table while buyers pressed close from every side. The Georgian SSR was part of the Soviet Union, and market scenes like this captured daily life during the first five-year plan. In 1930, a Soviet public figure visited women workers at a newly opened brick factory near Lobnya Station, each holding fresh bricks for the camera. The photo links early Soviet industrial growth to the heavy manual work behind every new factory wall. On August 1, 1944, Warsaw insurgents moved the first German prisoners from the main post office to the PKO building on Świętokrzyska Street. The scene captures the first hours of the uprising, when Polish fighters briefly took control of key streets in central Warsaw. A 17-year-old CNT militia woman left Barcelona on August 1, 1936, after running away from home to join the Escaso column. 1 month later, she was gone near Huesca on the Aragon front, making this departure photo her last known public image. Panama's Camion Pitufo was a Mercedes-Benz truck fitted with water cannons and used against anti-government crowds from 1987 to 1989. Its cartoon nickname meant Smurf Truck, hiding a machine built for street control under a strangely harmless name. Arturo Durazo Moreno, Mexico City's former police chief, appears in a 1984 booking photo after his political shield disappeared. From 1976 to 1982, he turned the capital's police into a private money empire and was accused of building a fortune of up to $1 billion. A woman linked to China's last imperial court lies in bed with a long smoking pipe in the 1930s, a quiet image from the final ruins of the Qing dynasty. She later died in prison after the empire, the puppet state, and her royal status all disappeared. On January 22, 1944, German aircraft struck Allied landing forces off Anzio, Italy, during Operation Shingle. Water columns rise around the ships, showing how exposed the invasion fleet was before troops could fully secure the beachhead. Polish women police officers patrolled Warsaw in August 1939, just weeks before the city entered one of the most tense months in its history. Their uniforms captured a rare view of public order in Poland on the edge of World War II. Snake charmers sat on the ground in Benares, now Varanasi, in 1924, with baskets, small bowls, and a cobra in front of them. The tradition mixed street performance with old family knowledge of snake handling in northern India. Palestinian women traveled between Nablus and Huwara in 1927, carrying bundled babies on their heads while walking beside a donkey. The road ran through the hill country of Palestine, where rural travel still depended on walking, animals, and careful balance. Children from the Stark and Schwartz families worked beet fields near Sterling, Colorado in 1915, standing barefoot and worn out before the camera. Their farm day ran from 5 in the morning to 6 in the evening, with only 30 minutes for lunch. A karate teacher leads a large group practice in front of Shuri Castle in Okinawa around 1938, before the art became a global sport. The castle did not survive 1945, making this photo a rare record of Ryukyuan karate in its old home. A German weather team on Svalbard was photographed on April 23, 1945, cut off in the Arctic while the war in Europe was almost over. They gave themselves up on September 3, 1945, to a Norwegian fishing boat captain. In Harlem in 1935, crowds gathered after a false rumor spread that a Puerto Rican boy had died inside a department store. The boy was alive, but the rumor helped trigger one of New York's most serious unrest events of the Depression era. Zurich's 1889 cremation furnace looked like a chapel, with a coffin platform hiding the machinery below. It was Switzerland's first modern crematorium, built when cremation was still a shocking new idea in Europe. Soviet tanks rolled through Prague in 1968 as 2 young women watched from the sidewalk through smoke. The Warsaw Pact operation ended Czechoslovakia's reform movement, known as the Prague Spring. John Steinbeck saw central Kyiv in 1947, with broken buildings still visible across the city after World War II. The visit became part of a Russian journal, his travel book with photographer Robert Capa. London Underground workers sorted huge piles of used tickets by hand to study passenger traffic before digital data systems existed. Every small paper ticket helped reveal where people traveled, when stations were busiest, and how the network moved the city. An immigrant and a pastry seller stood on a New York street in 1896, when the city was becoming one of the world's busiest gateways for newcomers. Street vendors helped feed poor workers and new arrivals long before supermarkets became common. Iran's first female cabinet minister wore full formal honors before the revolution that erased her place in power. In 1980, she lost her life after a revolutionary trial, turning her story into one of Iran's starkest political reversals. In Ukraine's Kherson region in 1932, officials stood beside sacks of grain taken from villagers during the Holodomor. At least 3.9 million Ukrainians were lost in the famine, while grain continued to be seized from rural communities. The pioneering aviator joked about tiny Howland Island before her 1937 round-the-world flight, where it was meant to be the next refueling stop. The island was only about 2 miles long, and her plane disappeared before reaching it. In the 1908 London Olympic Marathon, officials helped an exhausted runner across the finish line as the stadium watched in disbelief. He crossed first, but was disqualified because outside help was not allowed. A Folgore paratrooper sits in the snow near Moncenisio, Piedmont in early 1945, carrying wooden snowshoes and a long weapon. Italy's northern mountains were still contested in the final months of World War II, where cold terrain shaped every movement. 2 Folgore paratroopers posed in snowy Moncenisio, Piedmont, in early 1945, wearing badges and field gear in the mountains. The photo comes from the final months of World War II, when northern Italy was still split between retreat, resistance, and collapsing front lines. A Red Army artillery officer was photographed after being taken by German forces near Liozno in July 1941. His capture became a major propaganda prize because he was linked to the very top of Soviet power. A concrete German firing point from the 1943 Blue Line still sits near Krasny Oktyabr in the Caucasus, half buried in the frozen hills. Only 3 original bunkers remain there today, after battles in this sector cost about 18,000 Soviet lives. A French soldier in 1944 hangs a large portrait of Germany's wartime leader from the barrel of his tank like a trophy. The image turns a military vehicle into a public symbol of reversal as Allied forces pushed back across Europe. 3 siblings from a famous American political family posed together in 1939 before their family became a national symbol of power and tragedy. 2 years later, one sister underwent a life-changing medical operation that kept her hidden from public life for decades. The Harrison family of Jonesboro, Tennessee, lined up their 13 sons in 1955, creating one of America's most unusual family portraits. They became known as the country's largest all-boy family at the time. Nanny Mae Hill, also known as Sis Cook, built a public career as an artist, shop owner, and traveling performer despite being born without lower arms. She painted, wrote, sewed, and handled daily tasks with her feet, even winning prizes at the 1919 Texas State Fair. In 1956, the reigning heavyweight champion retired at 32 while still unbeaten, ending his career with 49 wins and 0 losses. He remains the only heavyweight champion to leave professional boxing with a perfect record. A well-known sideshow performer and actor also studied chemistry, paleontology, and anthropology, making his life far stranger than a simple stage label. At over 700 pounds at his heaviest, he later appeared in Big Fish and was remembered for his sharp mind. The MacDui burned off Port Moresby on June 18, 1942, after Japanese aircraft struck the passenger cargo ship. It grounded near Hanubata and became a lasting harbor landmark after its fuel was removed in the 1950s. A famous actress walks between takes on the Arizona set of Bus Stop in March 1956, still dressed for the role under the desert sun. The film was released in 1956 and became one of her most important dramatic roles. Buran, the Soviet answer to the space shuttle, sat on the giant Energia rocket after costing about 16.5 billion rubles. It flew only once in 1988, completed an unmanned automatic landing, and the whole program ended in 1993. A boxy early snowmobile crossed Antarctic ice in 1967, showing how explorers tested small machines in one of Earth's harshest places. Its fragile look hides a major shift from slow sled travel to motorized polar movement. A United States Navy sailor used radio gear during Operation Deep Freeze, the Antarctic missions that built supply routes and research stations in the 1950s and 1960s. He reached the ice aboard the Glacier, one of the ships that helped turn Antarctica into a place with permanent science stations. Anthony Crawford was one of South Carolina's wealthiest black farmers, owning more than 427 acres before 1916. After his life was taken by a racist crowd, his family was forced to leave the state within 2 days and his land was seized. Chernobyl liquidators cleared debris from the roof of Reactor 3 in September and October 1986, after the explosion had thrown material across the plant. Robots failed in the extreme radiation, so men were sent in for short runs with shovels and heavy protective gear. A famous American singer's father inspected his service medals at Graceland in 1960 after the star returned from military duty. He served in Germany and rose to sergeant, turning a global pop icon into one of the most photographed soldiers of his era. A 1929 rally at Munich's Circus Krone packed the hall with supporters years before Germany's democracy collapsed. The crowd scene shows how a fringe movement was already turning mass politics into theater before taking national power. In December 1970, the ruling party's provincial headquarters in Gdansk went up in flames during worker protests over sudden food price rises. The unrest spread along Poland's Baltic coast and became one of the key cracks before solidarity appeared 10 years later. In 1953, a man climbed a thin pole at Berlin's Brandenburg Gate to remove the red flag as a huge crowd watched from below. The June 17th protests spread across East Germany and became one of the boldest public acts of the Cold War. In 1987, Pope John Paul II stood beside a giant Michael Jackson Bad poster, creating a rare clash of Vatican white and pop star black. Bad was released that same year and became one of the best-selling albums in music history. In 1970s, Vilnius, workers walked through a new district of concrete apartment blocks rising behind them. These Soviet-era buildings were built fast to house thousands of families in nearly identical homes across Eastern Europe. British Airways Flight 149 landed in Kuwait in 1990 during the Iraq-Kuwait crisis, and the aircraft was later left in ruins on the tarmac. More than 300 people on board were held for weeks, turning a routine fuel stop into one of aviation's strangest modern stories. In 1976, a young singer appeared on the Sonny and Cher show in a German military-style costume for a comedy sketch. The odd television moment came 6 years before his 1982 solo breakthrough became one of the biggest album eras ever. In 1926, Benito Mussolini was photographed with a bandaged nose after Violet Gibson's failed attack in Rome. Weeks later, 14-year-old Clara Petacci sent him a fan letter, and she later became his long-term companion. At age 15, Sophia Loren entered Miss Italy in 1950 under her birth name, Sofia Villani Ciccolone. She did not win the crown, but judges gave her the special Miss Elegance title before her rise into world cinema. In May 1956, crowds carried the ornate bier of Shin Ik-hee, a Korean independence activist and opposition presidential candidate. He passed away during the 1956 campaign, only days before the election, turning his procession into a huge public moment. In 1986, a British royal couple visited the set of the Japanese historical series Musashibo Benkei, standing beside actors in full period costume. The scene mixed modern royal protocol with old samurai-era clothing in one of the strangest photo moments of their Japan visit. A chance-bought corsair skims the deck of the British carrier Illustrious after a failed landing in the eastern waters near Formosa. Its tilted wing and spinning propeller show the exact second a routine return turned into a rare carrier deck accident. In 1899, high school students near Washington, D.C. studied biology outdoors, using a stream as their classroom instead of a lab. Field lessons like this let students collect real plants, rocks, and water samples more than 100 years ago. In 1939, Czech officers spoke with German soldiers on a motorcycle in Prague as trams and cars still moved behind them. German forces entered the city in March 1939, turning Prague into the center of the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. In August 1945, Kenji Hatanaka led a last-minute attempt by Japanese officers to stop Japan's surrender. The plan failed overnight, and Japan announced its surrender hours later, ending the Second World War. Boston Corbett was a hat maker and Union soldier who ended the 12-day hunt for John Wilkes Booth after Abraham Lincoln's 1865 assassination. His life was even stranger than the manhunt. He was known for extreme religious behavior and later vanished from public records. Adrian Street stood in full glam makeup beside his coal miner father, the hard world he left before becoming one of Britain's most unusual wrestling stars. In 1971, his bold ring image was already strong enough to help inspire the young David Bowie. The Black Legion operated in the United States during the 1920s and 1930s, wearing skull-marked robes to make its secret meetings instantly recognizable. At its peak during the Great Depression, it was strongest in Michigan and was linked by investigators to dozens of serious crimes. In Lisbon on April 25, 1974, a Portuguese soldier lay in the street during the Carnation Revolution, the nearly bloodless uprising that ended decades of dictatorship. The movement also helped close Portugal's colonial empire, with carnations becoming its lasting symbol. A 1st century BCE Roman water boiler from Villa della Pisanella in Boscoreale survived with its pipes and fittings still in place. The villa stood near Pompeii, where buried buildings preserved rare details of daily Roman technology for almost 2,000 years. Between 1906 and 1911, Sergei Prokudin-Gorsky photographed 2 restrained prisoners in Bukhara using an early 3-color process. The color came from 3 black and white glass plates, giving a rare real-color view of Central Asia before modern color film. In February 1916, Winston Churchill stood in a heavy coat at Armentières after leaving top government office to command soldiers in France. The future British Prime Minister was 41 years old and serving on the Western Front during the First World War. In 1999, young Kosovar Albanians lined a road and made rude gestures as buses carried Serb police out of Kosovo. The scene marked a tense public moment after NATO forces entered the region and Serbian control ended. In 2004, operators worked inside an RBMK reactor control room at the Leningrad nuclear power plant, surrounded by hundreds of switches and gauges. RBMK is the same reactor family as Chernobyl, and only a small number were still running decades later. In 1889, a Somali ruler from Bender Qasim sat for a rare portrait with a traditional head wrap and a carved staff. Bender Qasim was a key port on Somalia's northern coast, later known as Bosaso. In October 1945, Vietnamese men took positions near railway tracks in Saigon as control of the city shifted after Japan's surrender. Within months, Southern resistance groups were reorganized under Nguyen Binh, shaping the next 30 years of Vietnamese history. In spring 1943, Italian Bersaglieri troops took cover in Tunisia during the final phase of the North African campaign. Weeks later, Axis forces in Tunisia collapsed, ending their last foothold in Africa. An Italian crew trains behind a camouflaged Canonda 47/32, a compact 47mm field cannon used across several fronts in the Second World War. Its small size made it easy to hide, but by later campaigns it struggled against newer armored vehicles. In December 1941, an Italian soldier directed traffic in the frozen Donetsk basin, thousands of kilometers from Italy. The signs point toward towns around modern Donetsk, showing how far Axis troops had advanced into Soviet Ukraine. In North Africa, Italian bersaglieri prepared Gilera motorcycles for a fast reconnaissance ride across open desert terrain. Their feathered helmets made the unit instantly recognizable, even beside the machines built for speed and rough ground. Daisy and Violet Hilton sit side by side as stylists shape their matching curls with the ultra-thin eyebrow look that marked the 1930s. Born in England in 1908, the conjoined twin performers became major vaudeville stars and later appeared in Todd Browning's 1932 film. Marie Sirois was a French-Canadian strongwoman who reportedly lifted 254-pound barrels by age 17. She later challenged male athletes in public contests and became known as one of the strongest women of her era. In 1966, a young Jesuit teacher worked at El Salvador School in Buenos Aires, long before leading the Catholic Church. Decades later, he became the first pope from the Americas and the first Jesuit pope. On January 16, 1991, a U.S. sergeant from Brooklyn rested on a stuffed bear in Saudi Arabia as a major UN deadline passed. The quiet scene came hours before the Gulf crisis entered a new and far larger phase. In the 1870s, William Howard Taft posed as a slim young man decades before entering the White House. He later became the only person to serve as both United States President and Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. In 1862, formerly enslaved families gathered outside a wooden building after Union forces reached their area. The image preserves one of the earliest photographed moments of freedom for people who had been legally treated as property in the United States. In 1963, Myrlie Evers sat at the funeral of Medgar Evers, a leading civil rights organizer in Mississippi. His death came hours after President John F. Kennedy's major civil rights speech, turning the photo into one of the starkest images of that year. Around 1911, a young girl working full days in a cannery was photographed with the steady stare of an adult. Images like this helped expose child labor and push the United States towards stronger factory laws. In 1936, a pregnant migrant woman stood beside a fence in Kern County, California, during the hard years of the Great Depression. Her portrait became part of the record of families who moved across America searching for work and food. In 1989, Monique Macias stood with her siblings, Maribel and Francisco, at Mangyongdae Revolutionary School in North Korea. Their father, Equatorial Guinea ruler Francisco Matias Nguema, had sent them there for education during the Cold War. Nichelle Nichols posed in costume for the 1968 Star Trek episode Plato's Stepchildren, where Uhura and Kirk shared one of American television's most famous early interracial kisses. Some southern stations objected to the scene, but the episode aired. A smiling soldier walks down a quiet street with a captured rifle balanced over his shoulder. The weapon is almost as long as his upper body, making his relaxed grin the most unexpected detail in the photo. In 1964, South Korean leader Park Chung-hee met West Berlin Mayor Willy Brandt in West Germany, linking two Cold War front lines in one photo. Brandt became chancellor 5 years later, while Park remained in power in South Korea until 1979. In 1976, a Cuban PT-76 amphibious armored vehicle rolled through Luanda, Angola, after Cuba sent forces across the Atlantic. The photo captures one of the Cold War's strangest fronts, where Caribbean troops fought in southern Africa. Henry Moseley proved that elements are ordered by atomic number, reshaping the periodic table before he turned 27. His death in 1915 was considered such a loss that Britain later protected key scientists from similar service. In 1939, a girl sat beside a wood stove in her family's San Antonio kitchen while her cat walked under it. The fruit crate seat, tin bucket, and patched walls show how families stretched daily life during the Great Depression. Sadako Sasaki was 2 years old when she survived Hiroshima in 1945, then developed leukemia years later. At age 12, she folded hundreds of paper cranes and became a worldwide symbol of children affected by nuclear war. Kim Ung-yong became famous as a child prodigy who could solve advanced math while most children were still learning basic words. By age 8, he moved to the United States to work with NASA, then later returned to South Korea for a much quieter academic life. Marie Hogue, a Norwegian photographer and women's rights activist, posed upside down in her studio in the 1880s with a grin that looks shockingly modern. Her hidden glass negatives later revealed playful images that challenged the strict rules women were expected to follow. In 1960, Adolf Eichmann was secretly taken from Argentina and flown to Israel with his eyes covered before trial. His capture became one of the most famous intelligence operations of the 20th century, ending 15 years of hiding. On April 24, 1888, George Eastman patented the Kodak No. 1, a box camera preloaded with enough film for 100 photos. Owners mailed the whole camera back to Rochester with $10, and Kodak returned the prints with fresh film inside. After the Chernobyl accident on April 26, 1986, the nearby city of Pripyat was emptied, leaving its bumper cars to rust in place. The amusement park was planned to open days later for May Day. On May 18, 1945, Marilyn Monroe, still signing as Norma Jean, posed for an early Kodachrome beach modeling photo. The release form shows she allowed the photographer to use or sell the pictures without limits, years before she became a Hollywood icon. In April 1926, troops lined a street in North Calcutta after unrest broke out between Hindu and Muslim communities. The clashes were linked to music played near a mosque during prayers, drawing armed forces into the city under British rule. In September 2000, Chongqing police escorted Zhang Jun after a major manhunt linked to a long robbery case across several Chinese cities. His capture ended one of China's most high-profile crime cases of the 1990s and led to a 2001 court sentence. On June 12, 1925, Monaco's royal guests opened their pavilion at the Paris Fair that later gave Art Deco its name. The exhibition drew modern design from across Europe and turned 1925 Paris into a global showcase of luxury style. An RRAF Vickers Wellesley from No. 47 Squadron flies away as smoke rises from an Italian-held airstrip during the 1940 East African campaign. The older long-range aircraft was still serving far from Europe, showing how wide the Second World War had become. Austro-Hungarian soldiers rest around field cookware during the First World War, packed together in a rare quiet moment behind the front. On April 26, 1926, Winston Churchill walked from Downing Street to Parliament to deliver his second budget as Britain's finance chief. Days later, the general strike began, turning that spring into one of Britain's biggest political crises. In 1947 and 2007, the same British royal couple posed 60 years apart, first as young newlyweds and later as an elderly pair. Their marriage lasted more than 73 years, the longest of any British monarch. Around 1900, Tsimshian men in Alaska posed in ceremonial clothing covered with bold animal and clan designs. The photo was taken by Benjamin Alfred Haldane, one of the first indigenous professional photographers in North America. Private First Class George Bruce Kelly from Pennsylvania sits in deep Belgian snow during the Battle of the Bulge in January 1945. He was 24 when he died near Butgenbach on January 10, 1945, during one of the coldest campaigns of the Second World War. In 1946, portraits of Stalin, Lenin, Sun Yat-sen, and Chiang Kai-shek hung together above the Imperial Hotel in Shenyang as a symbol of China-Soviet friendship. Just 3 years later, Chiang's government had retreated to Taiwan. Khairallah Talfa, photographed in the 1960s, was Saddam Hussein's uncle, father-in-law, and early political mentor in Iraq. He had been jailed for pro-Axis activity and later spread extremist ideas that helped shape Saddam's worldview. In 1945, an Igorot laborer carried supplies on the Villa Verde Trail in northern Luzon, while a U.S. soldier checked the pack. Vehicles could not cross the steep route, so local carriers helped keep troops supplied through a 27-mile, 119-day campaign. In 1945, a Soviet soldier raised a flag over Berlin as the city entered its final days of the Second World War. The image became a stark symbol of Germany's collapse and the start of a divided Europe. In 1954, Professors Erling Sivertsen and Svein Haftorn measured a giant squid found in Ranheim, Trondheim. The creature was 9.2 meters long, giving scientists a rare close look at one of the ocean's most mysterious animals. Around 1972, a famous singer and a well-known sports commentator rode together on a snowmobile in a photo that looks almost unreal. The odd pairing has no clear public backstory, which is exactly what makes the image so memorable. I will be very grateful for your subscription to the channel. Every day I try to tell you about such interesting historical photos.